Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman, South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Let me recognize our event co-sponsor. That would be International Security Studies here at the Wilson Center. So I thank Rob Litvak and Tanya Boyce. Over the following few months, the Asia Program will be hosting a series of events on India, and in particular on Indian security. Today will be an emphasis on India's relations with the United States, and on March 9th, we'll be doing an event on India's maritime strategy. The details of that event are pretty much set, and there are save-the-date flyers outside that you can pick up. And finally, in July, we'll be hosting a program on internal security threats in India with a focus on the Maoist insurgency. So, now back to today's event. As we all know, India has historically been disinclined to forge close ties with and alliances with other countries. India, of course, was for a long time a chief participant in the non-aligned movement. In recent years, though, we've seen indications of a deepening relationship between New Delhi and Washington, to the point that we're now hearing the word strategic in the context of the relationship. So today we'll be hearing from three distinguished experts. They'll be reviewing the trajectory of the India-U.S. relationship since the Cold War, assess the civil nuclear deal between the two countries, and discuss mutual perceptions and expectations. So we'll now go ahead and get started. We'll be hearing from the three speakers successively, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So our first speaker, we're going to move our way toward me from my right. Our first speaker will be Raja Mohan, who many of you know of. He's the Henry Alfred Kissinger Scholar at the Klug Center at the Library of Congress, at least for a few more weeks, where he's researching the evolution of India's grand foreign policy strategy and growing security cooperation with the U.S. He's also a professor at Singapore's NTU, and also a contributing editor for the Indian Express. And he's published a large amount of material. Few of his recent books include Impossible Allies, Nuclear India, United States and the Global Order, and Crossing the Rubicon, The Shaping of India's Foreign Policy.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And my task, what Michael gave me, is a fairly simple one, which is just to tell you the story of how we got here, from where we were at the end of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, there was the relationship was not in a great shape, to put it mildly, and the essence of it was captured by Dennis Cox's book. Dennis is here, I noticed, in the audience. Estranged Democracies, in a sense, captured the inability, I think, of the two countries to get anything done together. Today, when we talk about the strategic partnership, many of the younger people who have followed this relationship in the last few years, it's quite easy to forget how bad it was. At least the older one of you will know, how bad it was to have the ugly American and the insolent Indian together. It was a perfect match, a slanging match that was made, and it seemed there was nothing we could agree on anything. That we voted against you more often than the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We threw out IBM, we threw out Coca-Cola. We generally shut, and visas, because Americans need not apply. The general thing was we not only slammed the door in the face of the Americans by the late 70s, but we also put up a notice board outside saying we are not open for business. So in a sense, by the late 70s, the emptying of, the hollowing out of the relationship was so complete, and there was very little we could do together. So that was the context in which we found ourselves at the end of the Cold War. Given that, where we are today is pretty significant in terms of, if anyone had thought, even a few years ago, that India and the US would stop arguing about nuclear issues and actually do a deal. If anybody had thought India would actually buy weapons from the United States, we never bought a single platform in the history of the last 60 years. And if we thought we would be talking about strategic partnership, that would have been considered an outrageous statement. But clearly, we are here looking at the possibilities of a partnership that few could have visualized even a few years ago. And it was not easy that we've come this far in the last 20 years. And I think one thing that has helped really move this relationship forward was clearly the change of India's economic orientation. That is, without India's fundamental change in India's economic strategy, a way it thought about the world and way it conceived of its developmental strategy, none of this would have been possible. That is, as long as India was socialist, India was inward-looking, India had no interest in economic engagement with the rest of the world, there was very little we could do with the United States. It is the economic reforms of India post-1991 that create the basis for a different relationship. That is, both in changing the Indian domestic attitudes. That is, by adapting to globalization, we were breaking out of a very deep anti-Western mindset that we got stuck in by the mid-70s. That here was the only democracy that was outside, most anti-Western. I mean, that's a paradox you had to deal with. The only real democracy outside Europe and the West was also the most anti-Western in its public argumentation with the United States and in the West. And I think many factors contributed to it. The inward-looking economy combined with a whole range of domestic forces which kind of got together. The only thing we agreed on domestic politics about foreign policy was how bad the Americans were. That you had the leftists morphing into, the old anti-colonial, anti-imperial arguments morphing into anti-American or anti-Western arguments. The nativists, of course, were always suspicious of outsiders. They were xenophobic in general, not just against the West. The security establishment, which could have been a natural partner, but the consequence of the Cold War meant that those who were willing to look at the relationship from the perspective of self-interest had very little to do. And the absence of business meant there was really very little we can do. So I think all this began to change in the 1990s. And that this, at the root of it, is the change in India's own mindset, that how India thought about itself in the world began to change. And I think that was the basis on which we've really begun to construct a new relationship. A lesser factor, I think, but important one, is in the last 20 years that the Indian-American community has matured and has become critical and has become a bridge between the two countries in a way that it was not before. So all the good guys, we wouldn't kind of give them jobs. They all kind of left and came here. We used to call it the brain drain. That anybody smart, anybody who wanted to be creative, I mean, we kind of made sure they had no chance to work in India. So you had pushed out all these people, and we started a big debate about brain drain. Now, I think that community, which kind of, the civil societies had a good relationship between the two countries, even at the worst times. And I think that stood in good stead. When we opened up, finally there was a synergy. I mean, that the Indian-American community could actually act as a bridge between the two societies, of bringing ideas from the US to India and explaining India to the United States. So you saw these two factors, I think the economic change and the Indian-American community. And then you add the end of the Cold War, the three factors that produced a fundamental change in the relationship. Let me just look at three aspects of this change, and then we can move on. One, at three levels where the India and US had a problem in the Cold War. One was in their understanding of the subcontinent. That is, what is the nature of our positions in relation to the big issues in relation to the subcontinent. The second set of issues in relation to broader issues of Asia. Where did India and the US stand in relation to Eastern Asia and Western Asia? And third, in terms of the international issues. So if you look at the three sets of political issues during the Cold War, that each one of them was a conflictual one. Of course, the most intensive one was really the domestic, the subcontinental one, where the US alliance with Pakistan from 1954 actually set the tone for a deep distrust that Indians tended to, when in historical sense today you can say Indians probably over-determined or over-characterized the nature of the US-Pakistan relationship. But nevertheless, at a time when India was not willing to align with anyone, when Pakistan was seen as part of the Cold War alliance system against the Soviet Union, you had a situation where on the core issues of the security in the subcontinent, India and the US found themselves on the opposite side. India, of course, we aligned with the Soviet communists, and the Americans were with the Pakistani military dictatorships, at least according to our narrative. So you had a perfect situation where very little possibility for reconciling this. And in 71 war, of course, this came to a head where the US, you go to India, anybody in India who was older than 45 will always tell you about USS Enterprise, how Enterprise was there to bully India into when we were fighting for the Bangladesh liberation. So you have the memory that the US was standing against India's interests in South Asia. That took a deep hold. And what we saw in the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, is to really change that. And I think first, initially, under the Clinton administration, you saw the first signal that this had changed in the Kargil War, where the US seemed to take a neutral position. I would say even a position that actually helped India to reverse the Pakistani occupational sections of the Kargil sector. I think that was a turning point at which you had the Indians beginning to feel comfortable about the relationship with the US, that the US, it's not automatically, inevitably will take the side of Pakistan. That it might have something to do with the merits of the case, it might have something to do with the circumstance, and that it's no longer necessary for the Indians to assume the US would automatically side Pakistan. And I think once that changed, it became possible to begin to think and argue with the Americans in a far more comfortable manner on South Asian issues than before. And I think under the Bush, of course, this was taken to the next step, where that the so-called dehyphenation meant the US was going to deal separately with India and Pakistan and would not allow the policy with one to come in the way of the other, which created the basis for a clear, unambiguous engagement of both. And in a sense, the US got simultaneously good relations with both India and Pakistan under the Bush administration. So it is the transformation of the US policy in the subcontinent which produced a completely different framework that allowed the removal of both the Pakistan question and the Kashmir question. Because initially we had problems with Clinton when there was a whole attempt at, what was it called? It was called the preventive diplomacy, or whatever you want. The nuclear flashpoint, the world's most dangerous place, all that stuff under initial years of the Clinton administration. When Bush took charge, Kashmir was a bad word. Won't even mention, there's no mention of it in the India-US discourse. So in a sense, taking off both these difficult issues off the table made it easier for the relationship. And I think this is one of the unstated comfort-generating points that I think made it easier for the Indian elite to deal with the US. That brings me to the second set of issues that happened, which is the questions of Asia. The Middle East used to be a big problem between India and the US. We were more Arab than the Arabs. We were arguing with the Americans on everything they did. We liked the pinstripe guys, the guys in suits, because they were secular. The Baath Party was a good friend. And we felt it's easier from our interest to deal with these secular Baathist parties rather than the conservative kingdoms. Well, the US policy was the opposite, and there was a constant tension in terms of how we thought about the Gulf. And then we went further afield in Western Asia. India was hostile to Israel. India was seen as backing the Arabs far more. India was unbalanced in its policies. And I think, and both these factors created a situation where there was very little common between India and the US in the Middle East. When it came to Asia, it was even more complicated in a sense, where India's alignment was with the Soviet Union and the US alignment. We aligned with the Russian communists, you aligned with the Chinese communists. We had a nice thing going out there where our interests are clearly, directly clashed, whether it is in Vietnam, Indochina, you name it, across the Pacific region. So there's very little going for us in either side of Asia. But what we saw happen in the last 20 years, India changed its attitudes in the Gulf. The Baath Party kind of started disappearing. We started reaching out to the Gulf countries, the Gulf sheikdoms. In the West Asian part, we had a more balanced relationship. We reached out to Israel, normalized relationship with Israel. So in a sense, many of the contestations began to be removed, while Iran has remained a problem and an argument that continues to do so. We can take it up during the discussion period. But generally, the kind of arguments we had on West Asia eased because India's policy changed and India began to adapt to the new situation in a different way. In East Asia, of course, it was a different situation. That under Bush, under Clinton, there was a fear that the US and China were ganging up against India on the nuclear issue, especially on the nuclear test. And we had Bush, who actually comes and says, look, India is probably or potentially a balancing factor against China. And once that factor was put in, I mean, that India must be treated as equal to China, it created a whole new basis for India-US engagement on Asian security issues. And I think that created a whole new framework, which I think you saw in the last 10 years lead to extraordinary cooperation, maritime, nuclear, defense, etc. So you had, in a sense, both in East Asia and West Asia, we've changed the paradigm significantly in how we think about issues that exist. And the third set of issues are international. It used to be said that, look, when Americans went to the UN, they knew two things. The Brits will vote with you, the Indians will vote against you. I mean, everything else was negotiable. These two were absolute constant. I mean, the Brits with you, Indians against you. That, in a sense, the voting pattern, I mean, UN is not I'm not a Wilsonian, actually, a Jacksonian, so I'm not a great fan of the United Nations, but the voting pattern in some sense reflected a fundamental divergence of how we thought about the world. That is, the understanding of the US on any of the global issues seemed to clash against the Indian, and in a sense, that in the post-Cold War period, those divisions actually sharpened. They didn't really disappear. They actually got worse in the immediate period because as India began to adapt to globalization, the problem of a whole range of new issues that India had to confront, IPR, trade liberalization, how fast we do this, so the constant pressure from the USTR that we need to get our act together and we need to do more, and not at the pace we would like to do. On the political issues, the hyperpower, the dominance of this one power, they talk about sovereignty busting international organizations. Sovereignty doesn't matter. All you need is really to go change human rights, blah, 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 all that stuff. Once you had this agenda being pushed down the UN, the India's thing was to pull back into a shell and say, look, are we going to duck under the slogan of sovereignty? And the operational political slogan was multipolarity, democratization of international relations, all in concept, largely working against the notion of a unipolar world. Because even as we reached out to the United States, the fear that the US might do things that will clash against India's fundamental interests was so deep, and through the 90s, the fear that the US might do something about Kashmir, might undo India's territorial integrity was so deep that on a large number of multilateral issues, political multilateral issues, it was not possible to cooperate. It's only with the change in the US policy towards Kashmir, initially under Clinton and later under Bush, that we begin to warm up on global issues. And that we were part of the rogues gallery with the Bush administration. We loved the Bush administration. The Asia-Pacific multilateral mechanism, we named, on the International Criminal Court, on missile defense, against arms control. We loved each other. We were, first time on multilateral issues, you had actually India taking very similar positions to that of the Bush administration. This was a dramatic change in a sense that is, if there's anybody who loved their sovereignty more than us, it was clearly the United States. And when somebody said it publicly, there was actually a pretty easy way in which we could relate to each other and do things. But the more important thing, I think, in the multilateral issues, the biggest grievance or the difficulty we've had is on the nuclear proliferation question. That the NPT system and India's nuclear status, the center, I don't want to go into the details, Dinshaw is going to deal with it. It became an issue from 1974 till 2008, an issue stuck in our throat, couldn't spit it out, couldn't swallow it. And there was no way around it, that how do we square the nature of the non-proliferation regime with India's possession of nuclear weapons. And that led to the treatment of India as a threat to the international multilateral regime, etc., and that we had to square that circle, and that's why the nuclear deal, by saying, look, India can keep its nuclear weapons, but will have the benefits of civil nuclear cooperation, and that India would support the non-proliferation regime. That broad deal, I think, produced that significant breakthrough in which we could think about strategic partnership, and that's how we really moved from a situation where there was nothing in common to today in the subcontinent, in Asia, on multilateral issues, there's a measure of convergence. So where do we go from here? I'll just conclude with that. In all the three areas, there are problems. Under the Obama administration, I mean, secretly many Indians fear that, okay, the Americans are going to hand over Afghanistan to Pakistan and walk away one of these days. If that happens, or in the process of how the US deals with its problems in Afghanistan, might be tempted to cut deals with Pakistan that are hostile to India. So in a sense, the hyphenation that has come back in under the Obama administration is a problem. How much we dance around it, publicly we don't talk about it, that issue is back in the center stage. In a sense, if we fail to handle this properly, we go back to 54. We're back to the argumentation that started in 54 to the Kargil period. So I think how the US handles the AFPAC issue and how India responds to it is going to be a central issue. On Asian security, for the 8 years of Bush, there was a sense that India was going to be of some strategic value for the United States in structuring a balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. But if under Obama administration the policy shifts to a G2 policy, that a understanding with the Americans, for the Americans with the Chinese is more important than strengthening India. If that becomes operational policy, then again I think we are in serious trouble. So much of the energy that came into the relationship, if you remove that factor, the consequences is something we need to see. On multilateral issues, I was quite a skeptic for all the rhetoric from Washington that somehow US is going to come and beat us down on multilateral issues. It's quite clear that the US does not have a domestic consensus, whether it is global warming, nuclear issue, any of the great multilateral issues today, on trade. Whatever the rhetoric is from out of Washington, I don't see it really fundamentally threatening the relationship. So we are, I don't see what the president is going to say tonight, whether he'll even mention global warming, it's not clear. But whether it does, there's clearly no agreement within the Senate. So the US, until it does something itself, it's not in a position to push anyone. So we have, I think, some potential pitfalls in the coming years. But I'm confident that the way we're going to manage this is not going to be, because we have a bigger economic relationship, that the kind of problems that we might confront do not automatically mean we go back to the 50s. That while there will be augmentation, the relationship has changed fundamentally. There's greater economic depth and a wider contact between the two societies that I think will be able to withhold many of the pressures. But the important thing, of course, is if the talk in Washington and Delhi remains one of consolidating what we achieved under Bush, my fear is if we don't move forward, we're going to move backward. I think I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Raja. We're now going to hear from Dinshaw Mistry, who, to our great pleasure, has been here at the Wilson Center over this current academic year as one of our fellows. His project focuses on what he's going to talk about now, the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. He's an associate professor of political science and director of Asian studies at the University of Cincinnati. Previously, he's been a fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. His research is focused on global missile proliferation and on nuclear proliferation in Asia and South Asia. And his recent publications include the article Tempering Optimism About Nuclear Deterrence in South Asia, which was published last year in Security Studies journal.
Okay. I'm going to use the projector. Should I go there?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm going to actually pick up from where Raja Mohan left off. One of the points that you just heard was whenever the US and India talked about nuclear issues, it used to be a contentious discussion. This was essentially the case before the nuclear agreement. What the nuclear agreement has done is it's essentially bifurcated the word nuclear issues into two distinct sets of issues. One is proliferation issues and one is energy issues. And it's now possible to talk about these two issues separately rather than together. So what I'm going to do is look at proliferation futures and energy futures after this civil nuclear agreement. My main point is that you may still have problems and difficulties talking about proliferation issues, but on the other hand, there are many opportunities for collaboration on energy issues. So it is still possible to talk about nuclear issues and still possible to talk about many positive areas of nuclear collaboration, especially focusing on nuclear issues, on the energy side of nuclear issues. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll briefly go through the background to the nuclear deal. Then I'll talk about potential proliferation problems that may still be difficult to manage. I'll talk about energy futures where there is much more opportunity for collaboration. And I'll conclude with a quick summary of where we go from here. Very quickly, a preview of what the new civil nuclear agreement was negotiated between 2005 and 2008. Essentially, let me go back here. The premise, okay, this is not working. The premise is on the first line. As a responsible state with advanced nuclear technology, India should acquire the same benefits and advantages as other such states, which are the 5 NPT-defined nuclear states. And so under this agreement, Washington and the Nuclear Suppliers Group lifted the embargo on civilian nuclear technology transfers to India. And in return, New Delhi undertook a small number of commitments. One is to separate the civilian and nuclear and military components of its nuclear sector. So it came up with a separation plan where it would put 14 of its 22 nuclear reactors under safeguards. It would keep one breeder reactor outside safeguards. It would shut down one of its 2 military reactors, the Cyrus reactor, but it would still operate the Dhruva reactor. And it affirmed a number of existing positions, its moratorium on nuclear testing. It agreed to support talks on the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, and it agreed to adhere to stronger export controls. These were essentially existing positions. As the agreement was being negotiated, of course, there were a number of concerns voiced very publicly. Does this undermine the non-proliferation regime? Does it allow India to expand its military nuclear program? And what sorts of energy benefits would you really see from this agreement? I'll go through some of those issues systematically as we look to the nuclear future. The biggest proliferation concern was essentially that this agreement could undermine the nuclear non-proliferation regime because it's giving one country an exemption to a very long-standing rule. I'll save that issue for the discussion that will follow. And I'll look at another concern. Does it enable India to expand its military nuclear program? The concern had 2 parts. Part A, which I have up there, is clearly, theoretically, foreign supplied uranium could free up India's limited uranium for military reactors. If you look at the first point I have there, the demand for uranium currently is about 600 plus tons. And if you look ahead, as India builds more heavy water reactors, it would need another 700 to 800 tons of uranium. The domestic supply is currently limited, maybe supplying only 50% of the demand. Even if a second mill is added, which is just coming into play, the second mill would essentially fulfill current demand of the 4,400 megawatts, but not the future demand. And so you need imports or to make up the difference. And here the concern is, India would import, use it for its civilian nuclear sector, and use its domestic uranium. It would be freed up for the military sector. This may or may not happen. Clearly, this concern can be lessened if India just continues to use one reactor, which is always used for weapons-grade plutonium, which is the Dhruva reactor, which essentially produces plutonium sufficient for about 5 nuclear weapons per year. Not a whole lot in the big scheme of things. And of course, it could be essentially, this concern could be fully addressed if India decides it has a minimum deterrent, it does not need more military weapons-grade plutonium, and so it accepts a fissile material moratorium and an eventual fissile material cutoff treaty. The concern could, on the other hand, could be much greater if one of those unsafeguarded reactors, the heavy water reactors, is operated in a slightly different mode, what I call a low burn-up mode, to produce up to 100 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium a year, typically 5 to 8 kilograms of plutonium for a nuclear weapon. So this could give you 15 to 20 bombs worth of plutonium a year. That's an area of concern. As I said, it'll eventually only be addressed if there's a fissile material moratorium or a fissile material cutoff. The second aspect of the same concern is there's another reactor which was unsafeguarded called the breeder reactor that again could produce weapons-grade plutonium, and while it's still being constructed, it'll go online next year, and from around 2013, 2014 onwards, you could see this plutonium coming out as spent fuel. Again, this may or may not happen, and here you've got to look at India's long-term nuclear plans. It has a 3-phase nuclear program where essentially plutonium from the first breeder reactor would be needed for future breeder reactors. Very brief summary of why this is the case is that each breeder needs 3 to 4 tons of plutonium. India currently has perhaps 10 to 12 tons. So if you have a fleet of 4 to 5 breeders, you need maybe 20 tons, and all the plutonium that comes out of the first breeder would essentially go into the 4th and 5th breeder. This is, again, something to look towards in the future. And of course, again, one way to definitively address this problem is a fissile material moratorium or a fissile material cutoff treaty. So this automatically leads to the next question, the next proliferation issue. What are the prospects looking 3 to 5 years down the road for restraints in fissile material production and the FMCT as a whole? I look at this, I make 4 points on this issue. One, does India need significantly more weapons-grade fissile material? Currently, it has military plutonium from potentially 3 sources: from its military reactors, estimated to have produced plutonium for about 100 weapons until now, a little over 100, and by 2015 you could say about 150 weapons. These reactors have produced plutonium for about 150 weapons. Potentially some of those other reactors, if they were operated in a low burn-up mode, could have produced more weapons-grade plutonium. And there's always this stock of 10 to 12 tons of reactor-grade plutonium, which, of course, still can be used for nuclear weapons. It's not like it's ruled out completely. So potentially, we're talking at plutonium for a minimum of 150 and much more nuclear weapons. Is that enough for a minimum and credible deterrence? Yes, which means does it need more fissile material? Probably not, if you just extrapolate. Going beyond deterrence, what if you're actually talking about fighting a war? Now here you've got to get into doctrines, which is very difficult to project. Even if it's a limited war, does India really need more weapons-grade fissile material? Probably not. If you're talking about a major war, theoretically you could say yes, but in practice nobody is going to fight a major war where nuclear weapons come into play. So, on that first question, the answer is no. After about, let's say after 2015 or so, probably not. What are the benefits of stopping fissile material production? Well, they are significant, especially if you look at it at the big neighboring rival, China and Pakistan both. It would be in India's interest to freeze their programs also and not get into an open-ended arms race. The concern is especially so because Pakistan's nuclear stockpile is moving from uranium possibly to plutonium. There's 2 plutonium reactors at Kushab, coming online. Thinking strategically, it should be in everybody's interest to, stop that and agree to a fissile material moratorium. Conversely, it should be in Pakistan's interest before India's stockpile increases to freeze it. So, there are strategic benefits all around to putting a cap on fissile material production as soon as possible. The third point is that the separation plan, where you put a few reactors under safeguards, induces some habits that Indian nuclear scientists will already have to do under a future fissile material cutoff treaty, which is putting reactors under safeguards. So bureaucratic resistance would be less 2 to 3 years down the road once the Indian nuclear establishment is already doing what it'll do under a future fissile material treaty. The fourth point is that, in fact, this treaty is not politicized in the domestic debate. Far less than nuclear testing, which is much more politicized. A moratorium, of course, is still not in place and is still probably hard until global talks on this treaty actually, begin and a treaty is actually in place. If we look at the other issue, which is nuclear testing, the first point is a direct contrast to fissile materials. It's much more politicized domestically than fissile materials, but there is a moratorium in place, obviously because of the international norms. The big question here is, does India need additional thermonuclear tests? The point I make is that a larger yield does not translate into greater deterrence, especially in terms of India's principal security threats currently, which are terrorism or territorial incursion. Thermonuclear weapons are not going to deter more territorial incursion, more Kargil-like encounters. They're not going to deter cross-border terrorism. So the military necessity on these pressing issues is unclear. There are a number of points that induce restraints from testing. One is the reputational costs. Don't underestimate the social and reputational costs of breaking this internationally given commitment. Remember, the commitment was given in exchange for the nuclear deal. Plus, of course, existing sanctions could always come back. The energy cost is there if India does want to participate in the international nuclear energy market. It would essentially forfeit some of this with unilateral testing. And again, the strategic costs, it does have a yield advantage over at least Pakistan, in the sense Pakistan has not tested thermonuclear devices. Strategically, it should be in India's interest to freeze that status quo. With these 5 points, it's still hard to go from a moratorium to an actual treaty, especially until the regime moves ahead, which is the U.S. ratifies and the other few states holding out still ratify. It's only then that Indian decision makers will have to take this hard decision. Do they move from a moratorium to a test ban treaty? Okay. So in summary, those are some of the potential issues to look ahead on the arms control side. On the energy side, things look much more positive. 4 quick points here. The logic of the nuclear deal itself was that nuclear power provides energy for a growing economy, plus it's environmentally friendly energy. The scale of initial imports may be moderate, they may not be large, about 10,000 megawatts of light water reactors in the next decade. It's really the decade after that if nuclear energy takes off, it'll really take off in the decade following that. Pending, of course, serious questions about financing and technological viability, economic viability. Assuming those problems are overcome, you could see a takeoff. And India already had a domestic plan for a 3-phase nuclear program. This would be deferred even further down the road, but in a positive way, in the sense that you'd get much more energy if you defer this three-phase program to a later decade rather than begin it early. Quick summary of the 3-phase program was phase 1, India uses its natural uranium with its heavy water reactors and now light water reactors that will come in from abroad. The plutonium, which is spent fuel from that phase, goes into phase 2. Phase 2 uses the plutonium from phase 1 into breeder reactors, and breeders breed more plutonium than they get in. So at the end of the cycle of phase 2, you're going to get more plutonium, and so there's no more shortage of plutonium. It's recycled back into breeders, and it also produces U-233, which mixed with thorium, where India has no shortage of thorium, is fuel for phase 3. So potentially looking at phase 2 and 3 of this 3-phase cycle, you could see significant amounts of nuclear energy produced without any shortage of fuel once you kick into phase 2 and 3 on an industrial scale. Let me go through these projections in a little more systematic manner. Before the deal was completed, let's say baseline 2007, India's nuclear program was essentially domestic. You had mostly heavy water reactors, and the total energy capacity was about 4 gigawatts, which was about 3% of its total electricity, which means nuclear energy produced only about 3% of India's electricity. Within a year or two, whatever reactors are under construction will be completed. And at that point, you could see a total nuclear capacity of about 7 gigawatts, which produce 3.5 to 4% of India's electricity. The real expansion probably comes thereafter. I've put 2 scenarios for 2020, one without imports, one with imports. The plan for 2020 was to build 8 new 700 megawatt reactors, which is where the 5,600 figure comes from. And you would get a total nuclear capacity of about 14 gigawatts. With imports, on the other hand, potentially 10,000 megawatts of light water reactors, which is 10 1,000 megawatt reactors. You could see a significant increase in nuclear capacity. And in the next decade following that, you could see a much bigger bigger increase basically through imports. So you could see nuclear energy generating between 15 to 20% of India's electricity 2 decades down the road. What is the environmental impact of all this? Here's a slide I've borrowed from David Victor, essentially showing you that for every 20 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity, you probably save 150 million tons of carbon dioxide. At the bottom, you see India's projected CO2 emissions over the next 2 decades. So assuming that these new nuclear plants displace coal, that means the full substitution effect takes place, you could see some, it's not a big percentage, but it's a fair percentage of environmental savings through new nuclear plants. One potential issue here, of course, is reprocessing. As I said, phase 2 and phase 3 depend on reprocessing the spent fuel from phase 1. This will only kick in post-2020. The nuclear deal does not completely close this, but future agreements, you would need a reprocessing agreement, which is currently under negotiation, and And I'll quickly jump to point 3 there. Whatever reprocessing India hopes to do is probably going to be best done if it's in tandem with new international norms on enrichment and reprocessing, which are still evolving. So the concluding word is simply this: there are still some proliferation issues remaining. Closure is beneficial. On the other proliferation issue of securing nuclear materials, India's record is very strong. On reprocessing, it would be much easier if it conforms to evolving global norms, and the energy future is bright. So I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you. Finally, we're going to hear from Bethany Danyluk, who is an associate on the Modeling, Simulation, Wargaming, and Analysis team at Booz Allen Hamilton. And she has more than 6 years of experience conducting research and analysis on political, economic, energy, and military trends in a number of regions, including South Asia. She recently served as the primary researcher and author of the study, The U.S.-India Military Relationship, Reassessing Perceptions and Expectations, and which she'll be drawing on now.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Michael Kugelman and the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this event and inviting me to participate. I definitely consider it a privilege to be sitting on a panel with such esteemed guests as Raja Mohan and Dinshaw Mistry, and I'd like to wish both of my Indian colleagues a happy belated Republic Day. Before I begin, I have to caveat my remarks by saying they are my own views and in no way represent an official Booz Allen position or the views of any of my clients. The perspectives I am presenting are based on discussions that I've had with Indian and American defense planners, policymakers, scholars, and military officers, both active and retired. And the discussions also took place while President Bush was still in power. So most of the perspectives are transcendent, but Raja already mentioned a few exceptions. Because I've been asked to focus my remarks on perceptions and expectations that exist in the defense relationship, I'll begin with just a brief overview of how the relationship has evolved over the past decade, and then touch on some obstacles that still remain. I'll then move on to how Indians and Americans perceive each other and how they approach strategic issues. And then I'll conclude with some recommendations for next steps. So 10 years ago, defense relations were virtually non-existent for the reasons that Raja has already pointed out. Things started to pick up after 9/11 when President Bush removed the sanctions that had been in place following India's 1998 nuclear tests. The two militaries began to meet and exchange visits and eventually created working groups at all levels, such as the Joint Policy Group, the Defense Policy Group, and the Military Cooperation Groups. They also began exercising together more regularly and more frequently. Since then, progress has been driven by several factors. One is the performance of the Indian military. Then we have high-level bilateral agreements, developments in the defense trade, people-to-people contacts, and commitment at the highest levels in both countries to moving the relationship forward. In 2004, the U.S. and Indian Air Forces held their annual exercise, COPE India. Much to the American surprise, the Indian Air Force and their MiG-29s completely outperformed the U.S. Air Force and their F-15s, and this left a lasting impression that the Indian military was one to be taken seriously. The Indian response to the Asian tsunami at the end of that year underscored the growing prestige of the Indian military, and the Navy proved India was a capable partner who could successfully manage contingencies in the region. Indian ships evacuated more than 2,000 foreign nationals from India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal during the Lebanon-Israel conflict in 2006. And then in 2007, the annual Malabar exercise, which had up until that point been a strictly bilateral exercise between the U.S. and India, took on a multilateral character after India requested that Singapore, Japan, and Australia participate as well. So the success of Malabar 2007 demonstrated India's capability to take a leading role, and it also showcased the interoperability among the five militaries and the increasing complexity of U.S.-India military cooperation. Agreements. In 2005, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Minister of Defense Pranab Mukherjee signed the new framework for the U.S.-India defense relationship, which was the first agreement of its kind between the U.S. and India. It outlined a broad strategy to guide defense cooperation over the next decade. Then in 2008, the signing of the nuclear deal affirmed that the countries were well on their way to a truly strategic partnership. Moving on to the defense trade. In 2002, India acquired Firefinder radars from the United States, marking the first fruits of removing the sanctions. But the bilateral defense trade really picked up over the next few years with a few big-ticket Indian purchases. The landing platform dock USS Trenton, subsequently renamed the INS Jalashva, the C-130J aircraft, and the P-8 long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft. The United States is also a key contender in the ongoing Indian multi-role combat aircraft, or MERCA, procurement, and India just a few weeks ago sent a letter of request to the United States about the potential acquisition of 10 C-17s. People-to-people contacts have also been a huge driver of growing defense ties. Relationships that officers form during exercise meetings and visits are a key factor in building mutual trust and respect that will shape future generations of Indian American officers at the highest levels. And much of this progress has been possible because of the high-level attention the relationship has received in both countries. Indians and Americans credit the Bush administration for taking relations to the next level, and Prime Minister Singh for risking his political career to push through the nuclear deal. The Obama administration has expressed a commitment to picking up where Bush left off and has followed through with high-level visits to India and by hosting Prime Minister Singh as his first official state guest. Indians are still worried about Obama, though, particularly after the release of the joint statement following Obama's visit to China late last year and recent talk of a forthcoming G2 framework. So all of these developments have contributed to an upward trend in the relationship, and there's a genuine optimism that exists in both countries about where the relationship is headed. In fact, many Americans and Indians have stated that defense is the key component, the foundation even, of the broader relationship. Despite this considerable progress, there are still a number of outstanding issues that need to be resolved or at least understood to facilitate more growth in defense relations. First, India and the United States have dissimilar structures that guide defense policy and cooperation. In the U.S., we have a policy office within the Department of Defense that makes these decisions, but India doesn't. Decisions about defense cooperation with the U.S. and other foreign partners have to go through the Ministry of External Affairs, which is our equivalent of the State Department. so it can sometimes be difficult to reconcile the goals of MEA and the Ministry of Defense. Plus, it adds an extra layer to the process. Speaking of processes, the second thing is the bureaucracies in both countries hinder cooperation. In the United States, it's because of the layers of complexity and the plethora of hurdles that you have to navigate to achieve results. And in India, it's the lack of capacity that stalls processes and decisions. Third, political dynamics. Politics in India was really more of an issue a year and a half ago during the debate about the nuclear deal, but it did highlight how fragile political coalitions are in India and how minority parties can derail ongoing progress. In the US, leadership is constantly changing, and Indians worry about the possibility that Congress could impose sanctions and cut off India's supply of defense equipment. Fourth, the PACOM-CENTCOM divide, a recurring issue in the relationship, although not the sticking point that it used to be. The Defense Department organizes the combatant commands in a way that imposes an artificial line through the Indian Ocean, which places India in the US Pacific Command area of interest. Indians take issue with the demarcation because they have interests in both PACOM and CENTCOM, and feel that the exclusion from CENTCOM limits their ability to pursue their interests in that area. Americans want India to understand that PACOM is its advocate and that they can pursue all interests through engagement with PACOM. And now with the addition of U.S. Africa Command, Indians are feeling even more constrained. Finally, foundational agreements. The United States requires all defense partners to sign basic agreements that allow countries to cooperate with the United States, buy equipment, and share information. There are two significant agreements that India has not signed: the Logistics Support Agreement and the Communications and Information Security Memorandum of Agreement, or SISMOA. Not having these agreements in place constrains the extent to which the relationship can progress. Over the past 10 years, the way in which Indians and Americans perceive the strategic environment has grown more similar. India is no longer solely focused on Pakistan, but has assumed a more strategic view of the environment in terms of the threats it faces, such as regional instability, maritime security, and China's expanding presence and military modernization. That's not to say that they aren't concerned at all about Pakistan. They're certainly worried about terrorism and nuclear weapons, but they recognize that Pakistan isn't in a position to pose a serious conventional threat. So basically, India's view is no longer Pakistan-centric. The United States used to see the Indian Ocean not as a discrete area of interest, but rather as a crossroads where other important regions coincide. Today, U.S. leaders view the Indian Ocean as a strategic region in its own right, one in which the U.S. has fundamental interests, like securing energy resources, protecting sea lanes, and fighting terrorism. So leaders have begun to think about a specific Indian Ocean strategy, and building a strong relationship with India, a defense relationship with India, has become a key component of that strategy. Within this environment, Indians and Americans generally have common strategic objectives, but they differ in their approaches to handling them. So a few examples of that are terrorism. Both countries want to fight terrorism, but the United States wants to do it around the world within a military framework, while India is focusing on threats to its borders within its borders, or on its borders, using police and paramilitary forces. In terms of Pakistan, both countries want to see stability in Pakistan, particularly because of its nuclear weapons and the threat that those will fall into the hands of non-state actors. But for the United States, Pakistan is an ally in the war on terrorism, and for Indians, it's the source of terrorism. Iran. The common objectives here: neither the United States nor India wants to see a nuclear Iran. But the different approaches: the United States has not ruled out a military option, while India advocates only diplomatic solutions. Before I get into the perceptions Americans and Indians have of each other, I want to ask you to keep in mind that with one or two exceptions, it's been my experience that each side has a profound respect for the other, and that these perceptions exist within that overarching mindset. So some of the points might come across a little harsh, but I think it really shows how far the relationship has come that the two sides are able to have such candid discussions and take this criticism into consideration and keep moving forward. So with that said, in the next slide, I've highlighted 3 perceptions Indians have of Americans that I've heard most frequently in my interactions with Indian officers, policymakers, and scholars. The first is that the U.S. is too legalistic in its approach to the relationship. This means several things. 1, Americans are just too focused on signing agreements and putting everything in writing. The best quote I heard to illustrate this point came from a senior MOD official when he said, "Why do we have to sign an agreement just to talk to the United States about signing an agreement?" For Indians, this approach just doesn't fit with their way of doing things. They prefer to engage on a more personal level and to discuss general principles before nailing down every last detail. If you've ever been to India, you know what I'm talking about. When you go shopping, the owner of the shop will invite you in for tea and conversation for a few minutes before actually getting down to business. But with Americans, it's all about checking boxes, signing the agreements, and going home. Indians have criticized this checklist diplomacy, as they call it, because it's a rather unflexible way to measure success and doesn't appreciate the smaller steps or intangible progress, such as building rapport and trust. Somewhat related is the next observation that Americans are too impatient about the relationship and want everything done immediately. Indians explain that this disconnect probably arises because the two countries have different perceptions of time frames. The Indian civilization has existed for thousands of years, so Indians do not consider a month or 2 or even 3 to be that long in the grand scheme of things. The United States, on the other hand, is a very young civilization and used to instant gratification, so Americans are more sensitive about time frames and deadlines. These differing perceptions often lead to frustration among Americans about missed deadlines for signing agreements or plans that fall through for meetings or exercises. Third, and I'm not exactly sure how to characterize it, but I've tried, Americans lack sensitivity about a range of issues, whether it's not understanding the cultural implications of empowering the Iraqi Shia population, or not realizing how its actions are perceived in the international community, or not being cognizant of something as small as word choice or symbolism in actions. As a result, 1, the United States ends up offending people, Indians included, and 2, India can become wary of being too closely associated with the United States for fear that it will draw the same criticisms. Now, moving on to American perceptions of Indians. Again, these are the 3 most common perceptions that I heard during my interactions. First, Indians are highly sensitive about their sovereignty. India has had a history of being conquered and colonized, so it's understandable why sovereignty is such a big issue. But it also manifests in ways that inhibit cooperation. For example, it's been an issue in negotiations on getting Indians to sign some of the foundational agreements, like the Logistics Support Agreement and use monitoring. Next, Americans perceive a lack of reciprocity from the Indian side. Americans feel like they give more than they receive, whether it's in terms of scheduling exercises or working groups, or working to enact major milestones such as the Civ Nuke deal. An officer at one of the PACOM component commands summed up this sentiment best when he said, "We gave the Indians the nuclear deal and they gave us mangoes." For those of you who don't recall, a few years ago the U.S. began importing Indian mangoes after a long hiatus. Granted, the statement's a bit hyperbolic and not exactly true, but it does convey the frustrations Americans have about what they see as an unequal give and take in the relationship. And finally, Indians might be overestimating their capabilities. The good news is that India sees a role for itself in promoting regional stability and security and in cooperating with the United States and other countries to do so. But the bad news is that India's capabilities don't necessarily match up with these requirements. India is modernizing its military at a rapid pace, but it still faces capacity constraints in terms of equipment and personnel, and political constraints in terms of its bureaucracy and political will. So even though India wants to be seen as a great power, and the U.S. agrees that India should be a great power, it's not necessarily prepared to assume that role and the responsibilities that come with it. So looking toward the future, Indians and Americans have clear ideas about what they expect from the defense relationship. Indians are very sensitive about equality. They don't want India to be seen as a junior partner of the United States, and they see other U.S. partners, even longstanding allies such as the UK and Japan, to be sort of in these unequal partnerships with the United States. Instead, they want the U.S. to think of India as being in a totally different category, unlike any other partner. What does this mean? First, that India will do joint operations with the U.S., but alongside and not under a U.S. flag. And second, that India doesn't ever want to be an ally of the United States, because to be aligned with any one power limits its strategic autonomy. The other expectation Indians have is that the future defense trade will support developing India's domestic defense capabilities. This means that India wants to move beyond a strictly buyer-to-seller relationship and expects the United States to transfer technology, comply with offset requirements, and work with Indian companies through joint ventures or other arrangements designed to help India build its own industrial base. From the U.S. perspective, India has a prominent role to play, the prominent role in the Indian Ocean. So Americans are looking to India to step up and assume more responsibility for stability and security in the region and to alleviate some of the burden currently shouldered by the U.S. Some of the most promising areas that have been suggested are humanitarian and disaster relief, peacekeeping operations, counterterrorism, anti-piracy, prevention of illegal arms smuggling, sea lane security, border control enforcement, and information sharing. Americans also expect that the defense trade will expand and that U.S. companies will win some of the lucrative deals that are pending, such as the multi-role combat aircraft deal. For the U.S. to be competitive, there needs to be a level playing field free of corruption. India is working on this, but still has a ways to go. One action India has taken to level the playing field, though, is to incorporate the life cycle cost provision into the RFP for the request for a proposal for the multi-role combat aircraft, which makes the U.S. bid more competitive. Americans also want India to look at these deals not as merely transactional, but as a way to build interoperability between the two militaries and to ensure long-term cooperation over the entire life cycle. Managing the perceptions and expectations will require a common strategic vision for the relationship that will guide subsequent interactions and cooperation toward shared goals. To conclude, I want to briefly offer some recommendations for next steps that Indians and Americans have suggested to maintain the momentum and keep moving forward. First, get the foundational agreements in place. These are going to open the doors for closer cooperation and more transfer of technology, much like agreement on end-use monitoring did this past summer. Second, the U.S. should encourage India to take a leading role in exercises. This will increase India's profile and help alleviate Indian concerns about inequality in the relationship. Third, pursue joint operations in a way that accommodates Indian sensitivities. Two specific suggestions. One, structure command and control so that India retains control over its own forces. And two, move gradually, beginning with benign operations like joint disaster response before moving toward things like counterterrorism and anti-trafficking. Fourth, find ways to bridge the PACOM-CENTCOM divide. Next month, the Joint Policy Group is meeting in Hawaii, and there will be representation from CENTCOM. More of these types of interactions, such as Indian participation at CENTCOM dialogues, will go far to demonstrate to India that the United States understands their concerns and wants to accommodate Indian interests. Fifth, increase people-to-people contacts. As previously noted, these are a great way to build trust and develop rapport. The United States could increase available openings at war colleges and send more U.S. officers to India. Finally, a good PR campaign can help shape public perceptions in a positive way. For example, India should play up past U.S. support rather than remembering the USS Enterprise incident that Raja cited. It could emphasize assistance during the U.S. assistance that was provided during the 1962 war with China. And they should highlight tangible returns from the relationship, such as successful delivery of U.S. defense equipment and items received from the munitions list. As we enter the second year of the Obama presidency, it's important that the U.S. avoid the pitfalls that Raja spoke of so that we don't lose the momentum that existed during the Bush administration. These steps, along with continued efforts to understand perceptions and expectations, as well as a firm commitment from the leadership on both sides, will help create an even stronger defense relationship and enable us to better work toward peace and stability in the regional and global security environment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to the three of you. I thought those were very interesting presentations. And we're now going to go to your questions. And, well, actually, before we go to your questions, I was going to ask the first question. But let me put it this way. We're talking about the U.S.-India relationship. And I think it's important that we also that we think of this relationship in the context of India's broader relations, particularly with other countries. And one thing I've been thinking about as we've been talking today is the recent deal India signed with Russia, a civil nuclear deal, I think just a few weeks ago. Not only did it involve that, it also extended the long-term military cooperation between the two countries. So what I'm wondering is, what does this mean? Is India trying to deepen ties with a number of countries? Is it attempting to become strategic partners with more countries? Or should we be looking at this more of in the sense of India trying to respond to its high demand for energy? Or is it something in between? The question for, Raja?
I mean, I think, I'm glad you asked about Russia. I mean, I think if I might use an example, I mean, how we think about America and Russia. America is a new love, exciting, a lot of wooing going on, a lot of, it's tough love, it's very difficult, but it's quite new. But Russia is like our spouse, stable. We know what we get, and we get it, and no surprises there, and it's a pretty stable relationship. So throughout the last 20 years, I mean, whatever happened with the Russians up and down. We didn't let them go. And I think the part of the problem why our deals with the Russians and the French are moving faster than the Americans, because it's the way the legislation was structured in the United States. Because the Hyde Act and the subsequent legislation, the U.S. non-proliferation, those who were arguing for non-proliferation, made it necessary to go through more hoops to get through U.S. sales, because they were not interested in reactor sales. Clearly, that was not their department. So the laws of the United States require us jumping through at least 3 more hoops. Then with the French and the Russians, say, look, once it went through the NSG, they have no problems. They say, look, okay, I mean, whether it is state-led, state liability, reprocessing, which Dinshaw talked about, that they're ready to move. And the problem is, it looks like, okay, Americans have done all the heavy lifting, and there the deals are being made by the Russians and the French. But that's because of the way your laws are structured, and the sequencing of it was done in such a manner that actually it hurt the United States. But I think this is something for the US to consider, and I think we need to sort out those wrinkles. 1 or 2 left on the reprocessing issue, and on the the other one, the liability one, which I think that is set in the parliament, that will move. But we've got on the bilateral government-to-government thing a couple of things to move. But in terms of the broader thing, and I think just as this U.S. tries to engage all the major actors today, I think India is going to engage. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it. And I think that's part of the policy. But I think in terms of the value that the U.S. brings in areas on the advanced technology sectors, on the knowledge economy, on people-to-people relationship, all that is not replicated by anyone. Neither France, nor Europe, nor Japan, China, or the Russians can beat in terms of the density and the thickness of the larger framework. So I think there's I don't see any reason for the US to worry about it. What we need is to sort out many wrinkles because of the way the laws are structured, and I think then we'll move forward.
Okay, I ask that you wait for the microphone to arrive, and also to give your name and affiliation, and please to keep your question brief. So I'll start on this side of the room. Yeah, sir, right? Yeah, perfect.
My name is Jim Doyle, and I'm with Los Alamos National Laboratory. And I wanted to follow up on some of the discussion that was just made with respect to Dinshaw's view that there may be a significant degree of decoupling between the issues of non-proliferation and energy in the nuclear area. And I guess I'm skeptical that that degree of decoupling exists. For example, if India was perceived to be using either the pressurized heavy water reactors or the breeder reactors for supplementing its military plutonium supplies, that I think would be something that would have a direct consequence for the potential for energy cooperation. So I'd just like to look at, ask for a comment.
Okay, in terms of decoupling, as I try to project 10 to 20 years down the road, the scale of energy is going to be considerably, it's going to dwarf anything to do with on the nuclear weapon side. So if we are talking about a few nuclear weapons versus a very large increase in nuclear energy, there's much more scope for decoupling, and it's only going to increase as we look down the road. Having said that, a fissile material freeze, moratorium, and an eventual treaty is still beneficial, and which is why one of my points was quick closure is probably necessary, within half a decade if possible.
I don't see closure in the U.S. Congress. So this whole argument, India must do something, we are just waiting. I like to see this go through the Congress, the Senate. I don't think the prospects look too good. I don't see the CTBT going through this year or the next year. So I think the U.S. has to make up its mind in terms of that. There's been so much argumentation from the Liberal Democrats, from the non-proliferation and the disarmament, elimination, all the stuff, everything you can imagine. But the actual ground level progress is going to be pretty tough. And I think there's going to be contestation on every one of these issues. The verification issues, the question of what the Russians are up to, what is it that's being prohibited under the CTBT. They're going to be tough questions in the Senate. And the labs have to be pleased Republicans have to be pleased, the Russians have to be pleased. By the time we do all that, it'll look like a modernization program and not a reduction program. And I think the whole debate will be significantly different. So I think as long as India does the right thing in terms of support the broad objectives, work with the United States, which I think it's committed to, and I see no hesitation in that, that we can manage the divergence that exists at this point of time.
Let's bundle a few questions on this side of the room. So we'll go to Sabiha, and then the gentleman right next to the one who just asked the question, and this gentleman in the front row.
Well, I'm the view from Pakistan. I'm a professor and dean at a university in Pakistan, and I'm currently the Woodrow Wilson Scholar here. A very interesting and a very scholarly presentation by Dinshaw, my colleague, and lots of congratulations to him. I'm also an avid reader of Mohan, so my comments should be taken with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, I think it's important when we're talking about U.S.-India relationship and this policy of now, striking a nuclear deal and strengthening their relations, in the last couple of decades. I think we need to see it in two, from my point of view, I think there are two areas we must not neglect. One is, let's look at it from the point of view of its neighbors. What does it mean? Both India's relations with its neighbors and what about U.S. relations with the subcontinent and the neighbors of India. So I'll come first to the U.S. U.S. partnership with India is raising eyebrows in countries like Pakistan because, there's a lot happening in Pakistan at the moment. I've just come back from my country. There's a lot of, terrorist activities, and there's a lot of, deaths and violence, and children are dying and women are dying. I mean, you have one Mumbai attack and, everybody goes berserk. But you do have all this happening here. The second is that, this whole question about morality. I mean, we have this whole, political deals being talked about in terms of empowerment. But what about focusing on ethical principles? What about the truth? I mean, here it's all about, you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. And yes, this is true. And, for instance, I have Mohan telling us about the intervention from India and Bangladesh for the liberation of the Bangladeshi people. And I wonder what their perception would be when it came to Kashmir. So these are questions that I think are difficult to answer. True, India is a powerful country. India invites, friendly relations with powerful countries because of its strategic position. Nobody denies it. But however, we are concerned about the hawkish cries of India with its neighboring countries, for instance, an incident in Mumbai. So I just like it to be seen in that perspective, that when Dinshaw talks about reductions in, nuclear armament from Pakistan, there are concerns, and it is seen as a nuclear deterrence rather than anything else. So I just wanted to share that with my audience here. Thank you.
Okay. Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. One question to Raja with regard to the India-China relationship. Obviously, the economy of the world economy is going to be dependent on what happens in Eurasia over the next 50 years. That's going to be the big player. That's where everything's going to be happening. And peace and security in Asia will depend largely on the Indian-China relationship. And every time you come to a forum like this, whether it's an Indian forum or China forum, it's U.S.-China, U.S.-India, it looks like the Cold War all over again. But that the India-Chinese relationship is going to be very, very important. How do you see that the U.S. relationship with India fits into that and the perspective for cooperation with China on many of these issues? And for Dinshaw, I'd just like to ask him about the thorium reactors. Because the world's going nuclear and there is a nuclear renaissance, the thorium alternative seems to be a very important future since it's less of a proliferation risk than what we have today. Is India interested, obviously, in exporting the thorium, but also in producing these reactors for export? Has that been given a thought?
Okay, yeah. Go to him first, and then we'll come to you afterward.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Rajesh Kadian. A couple of quick questions for Dinshaw. Dinshaw, what would be the unit cost of electricity? And secondly, thorium has been talked about a lot, but the daunting technological challenges to bring thorium into commercial use. And for both Raja and for Bethany, when we talk of people to people, do we also talk of the increased number of Indian Americans in the country, and what impact do you expect them to be playing in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think on Pakistan, I think your points are quite valid. I've argued in public that when we were getting closer to the United States, we should have done a lot more of reassurance to our smaller neighbors. And I think, unfortunately, what happened in India was two things. I think, one, domestic politics got trapped into this massive, gigantic debate on is it the right thing we're doing with the United States, where the Prime Minister had to put his neck on the line, go to a no-confidence motion in the Parliament. And you saw 3 years of this debate. We made a gift horse from Bush into a Trojan horse. For 3 years, we kept debating that. And as a consequence, the energies were not there for doing the right thing vis-a-vis the neighbors. And what little we did with Pakistan, that was all in the back channel. That actually, in the same period, between 2005 to 2007, there was a negotiation on Kashmir. I know for a fact a broad piece of paper exists of interesting negotiation that took place. And I think it's at that time we should have clinched some things with Pakistan. We would have been in a better position, but we didn't. But I can assure you all is one thing, that I think the present Prime Minister was born in Pakistan, and I think who's done more negotiation with Pakistan than any other previous Prime Minister. I think is still committed to changing that relationship, and I suspect we're going to see some interesting things in the coming days. In terms of China, it's a very important relationship, and I think we saw in 2008, 2009, the relationship really go down. And the Chinese are quite concerned about India-US security partnership. They think this is part of the containment strategy, whatever they might say in public, that they believe that. And part of the reason why they've stepped up their criticism of India or try to undermine the nuclear deal, do a whole lot of things. The Chinese don't see the deal as some kind of as reactors and how much power. For them, it was a strategic move by the US. So they were going to gut it in whatever sense they could. There again, I think we should have done more reassurance with the Chinese, which we didn't. But my sense is, again, things that India is trying to calm things down with China, engage, because today Obama has come and reversed at least some perception of what matters first. But clearly, in terms of your economic relationship, China matters a lot more today in the context of the financial crisis. And in any case, the density of the US-China relationship on the economic front is way above what you have with India. So in a sense, China remains an important thing for you. My own understanding is that we need at least define some broad bandwidth in which we operate so that there are no surprises for either China or India in terms of where the US goes in the coming years. In terms of the Indian community, I think it's going to get bigger, it's going to get more powerful, and I think it's what we see happening is, unlike in the past, the community doesn't have to choose between India and the US. Today, I think there's a lot more toing and froing, you could work in both the places, and I think it's India's responsibility to create that flexibility. If you're going to set up universities, to make it easier for the Americans to come and teach, and to create the comfort levels where more and more American Indians can come and contribute to India's growth.
Do you want to go next, Dinshaw?
Yeah. Okay, I'll take these questions one at a time. In terms of general approach to nuclear risk reduction versus both Pakistan and China, well, I've always advocated, you can do it unilaterally, bilaterally, regionally, trilaterally. It's not happened that way, and by default, I think the global regime is probably the way to do it. If you have a test ban in place and a fissile material treaty in place, those two themselves are a significant check on quantitative and qualitative nuclear weapons expansion, politically acceptable to everybody to do it, all together. And it's just that the regime has not moved forward. So it's not, it's true. These countries stayed out of the regime, but then in turn, the regime has not moved forward in the last few years. So beneficial for the regime really to move forward, and then these countries to jump in, sooner rather than later. In terms of the thorium reactor and nuclear energy in general, as I try to show in my slides, the phase 3, the thorium phase, has actually been pushed back a little, in part because light water reactors are now available for the next 2 decades. And Indian nuclear scientists have calculated that they'd rather use the light water reactors for a decade or 2 and save the thorium for later. And looking at it in a long-term perspective, you get more bang for the buck saving the thorium for later, a decade or 2 down the road, on an industrial scale. It doesn't mean research is still going to go on. It's research will still go on, but industrial scale will be pushed back, which brings me to the question, is all this viable economically, technologically? Everybody is divided on the cost of nuclear power, and most likely what's going to happen is it's a public-private partnership where the government buys the land, provides security and regulations. So those costs essentially are borne by the government, at least initially. And the private sector basically operates on demand-supply principles thereafter. That's one way to square bring the cost down.
I'll just respond briefly to the question on people-to-people contacts. I think Raja already said that the increasing number of the non-resident Indian community in the United States is acting as a bridge between the 2 countries. In the context of the defense relationship, first, I think it's incredibly confidence-building, and it helps build the personal relationships between the young officers who are someday going to be the leaders of their respective militaries. It also increases interoperability in the broad sense of the word, because these officers are learning from each other, and they're learning to work together, and it will facilitate how they work together when they're actually called upon to do so. And another thing is it's exposing each side to the military culture of the other side, which can help understand some of the perceptions and expectations, and I guess not bridge them, but overcome them, at least the ones that are false. And in a non-defense context, I think that the Indian American community was very heavily lobbying the U.S. Congress for passage of the nuclear deal. So I think if there are other issues that come up that are sort of that magnitude that require a little extra push. I mean, India's been pushing for a seat on the UN Security Council, so who knows? Maybe the Indian American community can be a strong force in helping that get done.
Let's bundle a few more questions right in the front here first, and then we'll go to Ray and the gentleman right here. Then we'll move back.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. I'd like to raise the issue of a possible failure of the state in Pakistan. As unlikely as that may be, it's still on people's minds. And my question is, could it, if it were to happen, could it be dealt with effectively within the context of the emerging strategic relationship between India and the United States?
I have a couple of questions. One, on the strict sense of interoperability, what are the chances that we'll really get some defense procurement relations between the U.S. and India? Bethany mentioned a few items which have gone forward, but in spite of the in-use monitoring agreement being signed in July, there really doesn't seem to be that degree of activity and interoperability, and I just wonder where it's going. Second, since we began this journey of reconciliation, we've had a huge economic meltdown in the world. How does this affect the security relationship? Does it not make any difference? Does it mean that India looks at us askance, we're weaker, or does it mean that we can cooperate more as equals?
Thank you. Raja Karthikeya with SOSI. I have a couple of questions. First one is, in terms of the strategic vision, how does India see the world ahead because we're already talking about a vision for the 21st century. So as a unipolar world, or as a multipolar, at least rather a bipolar world, as the Chinese and even some American scholars like to look at it. So how does India see it? The second question is, we're on the eve of the London conference. The U.S. and Indian relationship in Afghanistan has been kind of, when U.S. wanted India to do more, India was reluctant, and vice versa. So is there a synchronization that is developing now, and what is the role that U.S. sees for India in Afghanistan after London?
Okay.
I mean, I think I don't think the reports of Pakistani state's demise are exaggerated, premature. I think it only ends up you writing bigger checks for Pakistan. So it doesn't change anything on the ground. I think people were talking about North Korea collapsing in '91. You see, it's now 20 years have passed. So I think you've got to understand there is some resilience in South Asian states, and I don't see Pakistani state collapsing. There are problems, huge amount of problems. I think the Pakistan army is still a coherent, solid structure. So I don't see that disappearing anywhere in the near future. So the problem is, as you rightly said, we need to talk. I would say India, US need to talk about Pakistan, Afghanistan. India and US need to talk about, and Pakistan need to talk together. I think there are a range of issues on which we should be talking. And my sense is a creative policy from Delhi and Washington can still find a way to address some of the core security concerns of Pakistan, of not having legitimate borders on both sides, or of its sense of a two-front problem, or its sense that its security interests are not respected by India. And I think if we address some of those, I think we can find a way out. So I'm still optimistic, and I think for that, of course, India can't do it alone, the US can't do it alone. We should be working together, and I think that is the most important thing. In terms of defensing, I'll leave it to... I would just say, look, I think you've seen as the C-17 deal has been announced since then, you have the trials for the rest of the process are going on. So I would think it will be a slow process, but I would say it's moving so slowly. As she said, Americans are impatient. But I see forward movement. At this point, we are stuck on the foundational agreements. If Obama plans to go to South Asia, I believe, sometime this year, summer, early fall. If that is the case, I think this next few months we need to use it to wrap up many of these 2.0 issues which are still lying around. So I think unless there is a political push from both sides to say, look, let's wrap up that a whole range of this minor stuff that is delaying cooperation and wrap it into a theme. For example, the US, even after the so-called strategic partnership agreement, still targets India with a large number of export controls. I mean, some of these issues. So I would say, look, export controls in return for solid collaboration of India participating in the dual-use non-proliferation arrangements. So we need to have an overarching theme that would release the energies on both sides to move things. In terms of vision, look, I think the best way for Americans to understand India, think of Wilson 100 years ago. He goes to negotiates his grand stuff in 1919 in Paris, comes back, the Senate, what it told him. So I would say, look, US was number one economic power in 1901. It took another 40 years for the US to take responsibility to sort out its internal argumentation. So I think you've got to, as India is an even more diverse country than the US, and India is nowhere becoming number one economy, it will be third, fourth, maybe fifth in the next 10 years, that you've got to see this process working itself out. So don't expect, if you think of the US, how the US evolved, I think it'll tell you how the India might evolve.
Let's see, what should I address first? I think I'll answer the question about how the economic downturn is affecting the security relationship. One of the really interesting things about India is its ability to weather this storm, and India has actually pulled through quite nicely, which actually works out great for both sides because the U.S. is looking to make money. The U.S. needs to sell its stuff, and India is looking to buy stuff, and its ability to pull through the economic crisis has put it in a position where it does have quite a bit of money to spend on defense procurements over the next 30 years. I just read a report, a KPMG report that just came out. I think it stated that between 2010 and 2016, India was going to be spending about $115 billion on defense. That includes, that's not just capital acquisitions, but I think maybe 50 billion of that was set aside for that. So I don't think it's having an effect on the security relationship at all. In terms of India's strategic vision, everything I have heard indicates that they're looking at a multipolar world, not a bipolar world or a unipolar world. And it's within this context that they're looking to kind of develop relationships with everybody so that they can maximize their strategic options. They've frequently referred to maximizing their strategic autonomy. So in terms of U.S. role or kind of the synchronization of roles for India and the U.S. and Afghanistan, India is sort of limited in its role, its military role in Afghanistan because of this whole PACOM-CENTCOM U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Pakistan is very sensitive to India being involved in any of the defense or the military efforts, and the best way for India to contribute in this context is through the monetary assistance it's been providing and the reconstruction assistance. And I think this will probably be the plan for the foreseeable future.
Okay, let's go to the back. I know there were a few questions. Okay, the gentleman with the blue suit, if it's blue, black suit. Right there. Yes, him.
Hi, my name is Felix Sanchez. I'm a graduate student at American University. And I guess my question is for Dr. Mohan. The National Intelligence Council had a report on 2020 looking at future trends. And one of the things that they report or they believe might happen is that in a multipolar world where India, according to them, wants to be a major pole in the international system, the international community will kind of wither away, and that there would be no structure of this liberal order, or it will be just kind of dissipating. And so I was wondering, how do you see India? Do you see India being a glue, some sort of glue in the community, or another pole with China, Brazil, Russia, kind of just, undoing the international system?
Look, I think on the multipolar, unipolar business, I think we are for multipolar world when we stand with the Chinese. When we stand with the Americans, we are for a multipolar Asia. So that kind of tell you, we don't want to live in a world dominated by one power, nor do we want a multipolar world leading to a unipolar Asia. So we want a balance, and that balance in Asia can only come in partnership with the United States. So, you should forgive us for operating at two levels. But that's how rising powers, I think, do operate. Second, I think the question you posed, this whole argument that India and China must prove they're the stakeholders. It's like saying, look, you got a club and you say, look, before you enter the club, this is my test for you. Look, we're not going to accept those tests. As it happened in Copenhagen, Mr. Obama has to run and find out where the Chinese were sitting. You've got to break into that room, find out if he's sitting there, and do business with them. So I think there is a change in the power distribution that is taking place. That doesn't mean if you modify the existing order, there won't be a new order. There will be a new order. In that order, what is the pecking order? Who's leading? Who's following? What is the balance between different forces? What is the weight in terms of negotiations? All that have to be sorted out. My sense is, as India rises, it will move from this argument about autonomy. Autonomy is the inertia, is the old argument. Taking responsibility is the new argument. And I think we are in that middle of the debate. That my sense is, as India begins to take more responsibility, its broader worldview will match more with the Anglo-Saxon worldview. Maritime, open trading, property rights, common law, will define the broader approaches of India. And those are not the approaches China will have or the Russians will have. So whatever you might say, we are still the children of the British, and that tradition, if it continues, India will be the biggest English-speaking country in the world soon, and that the culturally, legally, our institutions are tuned to the common law approach. So I would say there's going to be one hell of a lot India and the US will have to do in defining new rules of the road for outer space, for the maritime domain, for cyberspace. I see a huge space opening up for us to work together.
Okay, Bamitra, I think you had a question.
Okay. My name is Bhumitra Chakma, and I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Just two very simple questions to Raja and Dinshaw. First, to Raja. How do you view the China factor in India-US ties? I mean, there is a view around the world, and also I think in India, that the growing ties between the United States and India is to counterbalance the rising power of China. So what do you think of this? Secondly, to Dinshaw. You have talked about minimum nuclear deterrence for India. What do you mean by that, and what are the requirements for India's minimum nuclear deterrence? Because it's a very slippery concept indeed, and it's very difficult to define exactly what is minimum nuclear deterrence, and also what are the requirements in particular, because of the fact that it will mostly depend on what China actually does in terms of its nuclear modernization and other things. And finally, just another very quick one, and this is general in fact. How does India actually view of its role in the world, say in next 10, 20 years? And also, how does India actually views its role in South Asia, in the sense that what type of structure that India is going to build for the region? What do you think of that? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I think on the first question, on the US, I mean, look, I think most people assumed under Bush that the build-up of India was in some senses directly or indirectly linked to the American conception of a new balance of power in Asia. I'm not sure if that is the view today in Washington. If you ask Mr. Jim Steinberg, if you ask Mr. Jeffrey Bader, I don't know if you get the same answer. I don't think that is their answer. In fact, if you read what the president said in Oslo, what the president said in New York at the General Assembly this year, he's saying, look, balance of power doesn't matter. We are in the post-balance of power world. And that one nation is not bigger than another nation. We're going to build this happy community, we're going to organize this nice little community. Now, that view has been attacked in the US media itself, so I'm not going into that. So it is not clear that the operating principle of the US policy at this stage is India must be built up for a new balance of power. In fact, I think we've walked away from that. The question is whether we will go back to it if things turn bad between US and China is something we got to see. But don't assume that is the current principle for the American policy towards India. I think it's quite clear. This administration has made it very, very clear that the relationship with India is not going to be built on the basis of hostility to China. And I don't think even India wants a relationship to be built on that basis. In terms of the view in the subcontinent, look, we got to move towards an integration. I think that's a fairly straightforward role. Until now, India has not been proactive. Now I think it should be more generous to its neighbors, open its market, something we're trying to do with Bangladesh now. Create an open market, create the regional integration in South Asia. In Asia as a whole, do more a balance of power, a balanced structure so that no single power dominates Asia. And at the global level, increase India's weight in the international system where we become part of rule writing rather than merely rule taking.
I agree with Raja's comment, and that just kind of underscores the point of India kind of lobbying for this permanent UN Security Council seat. But also within Asia, India definitely sees its role as the regional stabilizer and protector of the Indian Ocean.
Okay, on deterrence, I think everybody knows I'm a skeptic about deterrence, but let me just go through this conceptually. What exactly is the utility of nuclear weapons in a deterrent role? Is it to deter subconventional war, conventional war, or nuclear use? If you go through them systematically in the South Asian context, they don't deter subconventional Kargil-like operations or cross-border terrorism. Do they deter conventional war? You could say they deter the quick large-scale military action. Yes. Do they deter gradual, incremental military action? Probably not, in the sense if one side wants to start taking 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles at a time, nuclear weapons are not going to deter that. Do they deter the other side from using nuclear weapons? I mean, that's what the consensus is, that nuclear weapons are only good for deterring other nuclear weapons. And even there's some question about that. So what is minimum deterrence? Of course, it's not been defined. I think it would be beneficial for, just for the global community itself to define it as saying, freeze your forces through a test ban and a fissile material ban, and just call it minimum deterrence.
Let's bundle 3 questions. First, the gentleman in the white shirt in the aisle there, and then the 2 women toward the middle.
Hi, Isaac Carden from National Defense University. At the risk of belaboring this question of U.S., India, China power politics, I wonder if I could draw Professor Mohan out a bit more on this question. You noted that when China looks at the U.S.-India strategic convergence over the last 8 years, it says it's being contained. And I wonder how India views the comparable phenomenon whereby China, perceiving that, feels a need to reassert itself in the Indian Ocean, for example, and also describes itself as being contained by China in South Asia. So how do you see that tension? How do you see that dynamic, and what does India do to manage this sort of vice?
I'm Joanna Hurlbert with the Public International Law and Policy Group. My question is also about U.S., India, China relations. Considering the large population of Tibetan refugees in India and the fact that the conflict over the Tibet situation will come to a head in the near future, presumably when the Dalai Lama dies, how do you see that event impacting U.S., India, and China relations?
Hello, I'm Azmat Khan with the Council on Foreign Relations, and my question is to an earlier comment made by you, Dr. Mohan, about addressing the issue of India playing a role in what's happening with Afghanistan and with the U.S. right now, and you're advocating for more talks. And within Pakistan, the prevailing consensus is that India's involvement is linked with Kashmir, and the fact that India was taken off or never was on the first place of Ambassador Holbrooke's agenda, or that Kashmir was taken off that agenda, is sometimes by some seen as a lost opportunity in terms of India playing a role in what's happening with Afghanistan. So I wanted to ask you what you envision, what sort of forum or space you envision these sorts of talks to take place in. How do you see them manifesting?
Okay.
China, I think you have Professor Yehuda. I think you might want to say something on it as well. I think in terms of the Indian Ocean, I think clearly that India has woken up to the reality that a rising China, its economic presence, its security presence, its military presence is going to increase all around India's neighborhood. I think India is beginning to counter that, not in a hostile sense. In South Asia, look, there's no point in India objecting to China doing more with my neighbors. I must offer better terms to my neighbors. If you saw the recent visit by Sheikh Hasina to Delhi, India is saying, look, okay, finally we're putting our money where our mouth is. We're saying $1 billion of thing for Bangladesh. We're going to be generous access to the market. So I think, in a sense, the way we're going to beat China is by emulating China. That is, you be more generous to your neighbors in terms of the market, open up, do various things. Second is competition. If you think Chinese are going to move into Maldives, we go to the Maldives and say, look, Would you like a free ship? We can give you one before the Chinese give you a free ship. We go to Seychelles and Mauritius and say, look, we not. So in a sense, you begin to preempt, not in a negative sense, but to step up its own effort in the Indian Ocean across the board, to reach out to various neighboring countries, to step up its economic engagement, to step up its political engagement. To some extent, that's already beginning to happen across the board in the Indian Ocean. China does a summit, Africa summit, India does a mini Africa summit. You see the similarity of approaches, and I think India more in the following rather than in leading. So there's no question, just as China comes to Indian Ocean, India is also going to go to the Pacific. India has done exercises with the Japanese and the Americans, with the Chinese pretty fuming about it. So you have, I think, as two rising powers, both of them, their footprints are going to expand. There's going to be some overlap, but the challenge is how do we mitigate potential security dilemmas that might emerge out of it. Tibet, it's a central question. You can always plot the state of play inside Tibet with the state of play in the Sino-Indian relationship. If Tibet is in trouble, India-China relationship is going to be in trouble. Because after all, from the Chinese perspective, India has given for 50 years refuge to Dalai Lama. The only country today which gives even a support in legal terms, like even the Brits have dropped the notion of suzerainty. India's position is still one of, it is China's suzerainty over Tibet. So in many ways, they see India as a problem on Tibet. When Tibet is under control, that's not an issue. When Tibet is not under control, that's an issue. So some way of managing the Tibet issue will remain at the very center of the relationship for the foreseeable future. So there's no way of escaping that.
Anyone else want to comment? Yes.
Michael Yehuda at GW. I'd like to raise something further on the China dimension here. I think, as you rightly said, the Chinese do not look at the new relationship between India and the United States as something benign. They regard it as something that is intrinsically hostile to them. And indeed, the general Chinese attitude is still very much one in which they are beset with problems at home, and they have, if you like, enemies abroad, or at least countries with which they have both have forms of cooperation and forms of competition. And in that sense, I don't think if you look at their relations with any of the great powers, you could say that they are real, genuine partnerships. And therefore, the issue as to whether or not the future developments are going to be benign and free of conflict, I think is something that requires conscious efforts. It's not going to happen just by improving sets of bilateral relationships. I think it's something that requires, at some level or other, the three great powers, if you like, coming together and finding some ways in which they can address some of these broader problems.
Yeah. I agree with you, and entirely. I think it's the triangulation between China, India, and the United States will be a central feature, I think, for certainly Indian Ocean, Asia Pacific. If you see what happened in Copenhagen, I mean, you have at the end of it President Obama's press conference. He doesn't mention Britain, he doesn't mention the Europeans, just one word for allies, whoever they were. That the whole focus on some global issues is shifting towards China and India. And I think as China has become the second largest economy, India will become, is now fourth or fifth, it'll get to the third place in the near future. So in a sense, the primary dynamic is going to be between these three countries. And the rest really adapting to this, and given the problems in Russia, Japan, and Europe, this is going to be the main, the triangle that's going to shape the international politics. I have no doubt in my mind. And you're also right that, we've had a level of equilibrium with the Chinese that is breaking down. That we pretend to be friends, we say nice things to each other, we stand and abuse the Americans publicly. You scratch us and privately we say, look, we don't believe a word of it. So this coda, this third world solidarity, Asian brothers and all that stuff, neither side believes it. But it's you had this Panchsheel legacy and you keep talking about this. And both of us are trying to cut a deal with the Americans, something better than what the other side has. So the jousting between the three will go on. And I think vis-a-vis the Chinese, we need to work to create a more open relationship. One which publicly recognizes the problems. Today you have a situation where publicly we say nice things, privately we nurse grievances. That has to change and say, look, here we have problems on the boundary, we're going to have a problem with Dalai Lama, we have a problem on the Indian Ocean. These issues must be addressed up front rather than pretending to push them under the carpet by talking about this nice-sounding globalist solidarity slogans. I think so that deception has to end. I just want to address the previous question. I think, sorry, I didn't answer last time. Look, if Kashmir was on open mandate of Holbrooke, he wouldn't get a visa to go to Delhi. So I think it was in his interest to drop Kashmir for the public consumption. But I don't believe for a second that it is off the agenda. There's a Kashmir itch is pretty strong in this town. Everybody wants to mediate and do something about it. But the fact is, the empirical record is, we made the best progress when Americans were not involved. That should tell you something. That it is under the Bush administration, when Bush administration explicitly disavowed a role in Kashmir, that we've been able to negotiate a substantive, significant document that Manmohan Singh and Musharraf negotiated. No previous Prime Minister in India was willing to go that far as he has gone. So I would say, I think India and Pakistan are capable of, my old friend Jaswant Singh used to say, look, we speak the same language, we can negotiate. We don't need American English translation between the Hindi-speaking and the Hindustani-speaking or Urdu-speaking Indians and the Pakistani. So, in fact, the lesser expectations the US gives to Pakistan, that it is going to come on its side and tilt the balance, there's more chances of actual negotiation. So my sense is India and Pakistan have negotiated in the last decade. My sense is they will negotiate and find a way out on their own. And they don't need advice or guidance from the United States or the Chinese or anybody else.
Yes, question here.
Hi, Bill Wood from the State Department. Along the Sherlock Holmes principle of the dog that didn't bark, West Asia is not just India and China, and it's also Japan and Russia, and it's whatever Central Asia, the Central Asian countries are going to be, and it's the wild cards of North Korea and Iran and perhaps some others. And I guess from my perspective, it looks more like an alignment of powerful nations with looks like an alignment of powerful nations with overlapping interests that resembles 19th century Europe. And the idea is going to be to avoid 20th century Europe. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on sort of the larger Western Asia with these extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily powerful, very agile, rapidly changing, slightly immature in some ways countries, and how they are going. What do you think that the equivalent of the 20th century for Western Asia is going to be? Of the European 20th century is going to be?
I think you're talking about Western Asia as the Middle East, or you're talking about the broader.
Answer whatever question you'd like to answer.
That's a good mandate. Look, I think there's this whole debate whether Asia's future is Europe's past. I think there are two views clearly. Those who think that, look, Asia will be like Europe of the 19th century, and the challenge would be to prevent it from drifting down the 20th century European experience. There are others who believe Asia can do the alphabet soup of what the Europeans have done, and they're under-institutionalized, underdeveloped in terms of regionalism, and if only you had more regional institutions, you'll have peace in Asia. I'm somehow more, in the old British tradition of empiricism and more of a practical approach that a rising China and a rising India will not accept, they're not Germany and France, to accept an American-guided or a supranational umbrella that's going to just merely put them into slots. They're going to be just like the United States. Multilateralism where convenient, unilateralism where necessary. I mean, that's, I think, the American definition of multilateralism. We are happy to endorse that in full. Whatever might be the current rhetoric in Washington, that the U.S. is not going to subsume its options under a bunch of crazy bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats in New York. India and China are also not going to do. So in a sense, we are of the same ilk, that as large countries, we're not going to let someone else decide our options for us. But within that limit, I think, as I said, in the triangular sense, that unlike in Europe where there was no, the resolution had to be managed by an outside power, the United States and later and the Soviet Union. Here I think the very process of rise of China and India is intimately linked to what the US does. So I would say this will not be like Europe. I mean, history never repeats itself. It will be more like three large countries here. I mean, when you talk about the great European powers, the textbook on European politics, we're talking about great powers in the Westphalian system, 20 million each. The US and Russia were the first countries to have three-figure populations. We're talking about 2 billion people. When they get to $2,000 per capita, $3,000 per capita, that world is going to look, I think none of us can imagine that world, what it does to prosperity for 2.5 billion people, to resources, to every single arrangement in the world. And the US will be the only with 500 million odd people in the next 20 years, that you have these three mega-sized territorial entities which will have to find a way through the world's problems. And if they agree on something, the rest, we will do a bore for the multilateralists when we stand on multilateral platforms. But it is essentially going to be, can you harmonize the conceptions of India, China, and the United States?
All right, we have time for one final question, so right in the back there.
Anshuman Apte from Voice of America India Service. I have two questions, one for Dr. Mohan and one for Dr. Mistry. Looking at Afghanistan and India's potential role in Afghanistan, India has already expressed that it would not like to differentiate between good Taliban, bad Taliban, good Al-Qaeda, bad Al-Qaeda. Now, Washington seems to have an opinion, maybe like a coherent opinion that, yeah, Taliban needs to be differentiated with good Taliban should be separated, including some say Mullah Omar's group and so on and so forth. Do you think that the domestic compulsions may actually press Washington to take an approach which is essentially different from an Indian one vis-a-vis Afghanistan? For Dr. Mistry, my question is vis-a-vis the nuclear deal, how do you expect India and US moving forward in that direction in, say, next 5 years?
You want to go first?
In the next 5 years, it's quite possible that there'll be India will sign agreements for 10,000 megawatt nuclear parks with a Russian consortium, a French consortium, and an American-led consortium. So that you could see that in 5 years.
I think on the nuclear thing, and I think forget the next 5 years, we've got to sort this out in the next 5 months. That the US president is going back to India on short notice. Whatever the unresolved wrinkles on the nuclear issue, export controls, non-proliferation, these set of issues, I think, and the Indian Prime Minister is also going to come here in April for the nuclear summit. So I think we have a window of next 5 months to sort out much of the debris from the nuclear stuff and I think provide a clean slate and so that we can look at the new challenges that are going to come in the nuclear domain. I mean, I think what we've had in the past is not going to be our problem. What happens if Russia and America come down to the level of China? What will be the nature of the balance between US, China, and Russia on the nuclear side? So there are going to be a whole range of new issues. So I think we need to finish off the old agenda, and I think we have a good window for the next 5 months to do it. On the Afghan issue, I mean, I don't understand this slogan of good Taliban and bad Taliban or Indians protesting to the Americans. The Americans will do what is right for them. We can't dictate to the Americans saying, look, you fight till the last American in Afghanistan. I mean, I would love to see the Americans fight till the last American. No, but that's not the way the Congress is going to believe here. If the Americans think the war is unsustainable, they're going to cut deals. And I think that's a natural thing to do. Why should India be shocked about it? To keep, like, it's like a boy stood on the burning deck. We go and say good Taliban, bad Taliban. Our minister has said it again in London. This is a complete baloney. That is, if Taliban is winning on the battleground, the international community has moved pretty rapidly in the last few days. We'll see what happens tomorrow. They're going to try and cut deals with the Taliban. Whether the Taliban cuts a deal or not is a different issue. Because as someone who's winning, they're going to extract a lot more out of the international community. Whether the deal can actually be clinched or not is a different issue. But I think India has to change its policy by saying, look, as the international community changes its position, India must find a way of reaching out to the Pashtuns, because the question is not good Taliban or bad Taliban. India must reach out to the Pashtuns who feel grievance, who have a grievance that the present system does not represent their aspirations. So I think India has every incentive, every logic to reach out, engage every group in Afghanistan. And rather than complaining about the Americans or complaining about the Pakistanis, India must do what is right, which is reach out to everyone, help the peace process, rather than always saying good Taliban, bad Taliban. That's not going to work, because everyone else's position is changing very, very, very rapidly. And I think India's song on Afghanistan needs to be rewritten. Hopefully it will be done in the next few weeks.
Bethany, you have the last word.
Oh, I don't really want to make a point. I just wanted to make a correction on something I said before. The $115 billion quote that I mentioned before was, in fact, the capital expenditure forecast, and the total was $280 billion. That's it.
All right, well, we need to wrap up for two reasons. One is that it's just past 5:30, and two, I don't know if it's just me, but the temperature up here has become very cold and unbearable. But anyway, if you liked what you heard today, or even if you didn't like what you heard today, keep in mind we're going to be doing an event in just a few weeks on maritime issues in India, which will touch on a lot of the same themes from today. So please join me in a round of applause for our speakers.